The presentations so far have dealt with what one might call normal consciousness. And for decades, my experience with the consciousness research community as a parapsychologist has been that first we must understand normal consciousness before we can even begin to consider the paranormal. And I'd like to suggest that one could equally look at it from the opposite point of view, which is you're not going to understand normal consciousness at all until you begin to integrate the data of the paranormal. So that's what my talk is about today. And to be frank, even people in the parapsychology community have had a lot of trouble with the kind of data I'm about to present, because it goes well beyond experimental parapsychology and card guessing experiments. I'm going to talk to you about Ted Owens, the PK man. There's his picture in the center of the slide. I wrote a book about him. It was published in 2020. Ted Owens is also the author of the book on the right called How to Contact Space People. He's an individual who claims he's been in contact with alien beings. He calls them the space intelligences, hyperdimensional beings. He doesn't say they came from another planet, but from another dimension of time and space, and that they have bestowed upon him certain paranormal abilities. I met him in 1976 and worked with him until his death in 1987. I have in my files hundreds of examples of demonstrations, well, to be precise, about 160 examples of demonstrations of psychokinesis. PK is the parapsychological abbreviation for psychokinesis, or mind over matter. And he claimed that he could perform feats of psychokinesis because he was in telepathic contact with these alien space intelligences, and they actually had the power to perform various feats that he would ask them to do. For example, when I first encountered him, I was visiting Hal Puthoff and Russell Targ at SRI International in February of 1976. And it was at a time when there was a drought going on in the state of California. Ted Owens had written to them and said, you know, I'm the world's greatest psychic. Why are you spending your time studying Uri Geller, which they were at the time? He said, I can do much more. And Owens was a very flamboyant character. Puthoff and Targ were getting funding from the CIA to do psychic research, and the last thing they wanted was a flamboyant psychic to work with. They had enough trouble with Uri Geller, so they ignored him. And he wrote to them and said, I'm going to prove to you that I am the world's greatest psychic. At the time, the newspaper headlines were saying no end in sight to the drought. He said, I'm going to end this drought, and you'll know I did it because there will be rain and snow and sleet and hail. And your local newspaper within a few days is going to run a story saying that the drought is over, which is what happened. So I arrived at their offices at SRI shortly after this event, and the office was buzzing about this strange thing that had occurred, a rare snowstorm that had ended the drought. But they wanted to get rid of this case. They didn't want to have to deal with it. And at the time, I was a promising graduate student, so they asked me to take over the case. They handed me all their files. In those files, I saw that he had a history of being able to produce on demand UFO sightings. Here is an affidavit about one such sighting that occurred in Virginia in 1973. And reported in the newspaper. Typically, Owens would send letters to the scientists he was in communication with or journalists, and he would announce what he was about to do, and then he would send off the newspaper clippings regarding what had actually happened. And as you can see, UFO appearances were among the things he was known to produce. Here is an affidavit of an attorney in Philadelphia who Owens at the time was working as a typist in his law office. And they were out in the stairwell of this skyscraper in Philadelphia. Owens was bragging at the time that he could make lightning strike. At the time, it was not raining. It was an overcast day. And so this attorney, Sidney Margulies, whom I've interviewed on a couple of occasions, said to Owens, well, why don't you make lightning strike right over there by the Camden Bridge? Owens pointed his finger like this at the Camden Bridge, and within about a minute, a bolt of lightning came and struck at that location. It was the only lightning in the sky at the time. So this is the sort of thing he was known for. And when I met him, I asked him, could you produce a UFO for me? And he said he would. And we set up this study. I call it the San Francisco Experiment. And it ran for a 90-day period. He said he would produce 3 sightings in the San Francisco Bay Area. And we got one such sighting. A man in Concord, California, near San Francisco, was abducted, he claimed, at 4 a.m. He reported it to police. We interviewed the man. He had had no prior history of anything of this sort. And so it looked like the experiment was underway and off to a good start. We actually even set up a control group using the San Diego metropolitan area, which is roughly the same population and geography as in San Francisco, as a control. And I can tell you in that 90-day period, there were no reports of anything comparable in the San Diego area. And then in December, in early December, I had a phone call with Ted Owens, and he said to me, Jeffrey, I can feel it coming. This is going to be huge, one of the biggest UFO sightings ever. It's going to be seen by hundreds of people. It's going to be photographed, and the photograph is going to be published on the front page of one of your local newspapers. Well, 5 days later, that's exactly what happened. This is a picture from the front page of the Berkeley Gazette. I think the date was December 12th, 1976. The art department at Sonoma State College, about 50 miles north of San Francisco, had sponsored this aerial artist named Stephen Pileski, who flew a small airplane with smoke trailing out the back, and that was his art form. So he's flying over the campus, creating designs in the air, when a UFO appeared right in his airspace. The whole art department was outside photographing what he was doing. And so the UFO was seen by hundreds of people on the ground, and it was also simultaneously seen by the pilot in the air. It was at about 3,000 feet. It was a small lozenge-shaped UFO. It was photographed, it was videotaped as well, and the videotape was broadcast on the Channel 9 evening news. So this was just a remarkable hit for Ted Owens. The fact that he was able to predict the picture being published on the front page of a local newspaper, I thought that was quite unusual and very striking. Then I ignored Owens for many years after that because, like most psychics, he was not 100% accurate. He had a troubled personality, I guess it would be fair to say. He was declaring war against the U.S. government, and according to him and according to the news stories he was sending me, his war involved poltergeist activities on naval ships. Then one day he called me up. It was Christmas Eve, 1985, and I'll never forget this. He said to me, "Jeffrey, this is the most important phone call you will ever receive. It's up to you now. You've got to tell the US government not to launch the next space shuttle, because if they do, my UFOs are going to blow it out of the sky." And of course, I ignored him. I had no status whatsoever with the US government. They weren't about to listen to me. And certainly a cockamamie story about some psychic told me you shouldn't launch a space shuttle wasn't going to get me anywhere. And of course, a month later, when the Challenger space shuttle exploded, I was shaken to my bones. And I felt that I needed to learn and understand more about this character, Ted Owens, I had been studying. I took his training program, and because of time limitations now, I'm not going to go into the details of his training program and how it impacted me, but I except to say the impact was quite significant. What I want to share with you are recent events that took place. Just about a year ago, on December 12th, I received an email from a viewer of the New Thinking Aloud channel that I host on YouTube, a fellow named Javier Flores, who was in Germany, who said that he had been meditating. He was a deep meditator. He had been meditating for about half an hour when an image appeared in his mind. And he approached that image mentally, and he realized it was a human being. And it seemed like a very angry human being, he said. And then he said, as he began to approach it, he recognized the figure in his mind as that of Ted Owens, because as a viewer of New Thinking Aloud, he had heard me do some monologues and interviews about the Ted Owens case. And he said, I began to have a dialogue with Ted Owens, who died, incidentally, 35 years earlier in 1987. Said Ted Owens was telling him that he thought I, Jeffrey Mishlove, wanted to reach out to him. And if I did, I could do so in meditation. And I tried to do that. When I got this message, I thought, well, that might be interesting if I could contact Ted Owens. And on December 28th, about 2 weeks later, I felt that I had. I was in a hypnagogic state. Sometimes when I'm in bed at night and I wake up, I try to meditate if there's nothing else to do. And it was like that. I was in bed in a meditative state, kind of a hypnagogic state, when I felt like I had contacted Owens and had a communication with him. And in my communication at that time, I was very mindful of the situation in Ukraine. If you go back about a year ago, the war in Ukraine had been going on for months. The Ukrainians were about to enter into winter. The winter season was just beginning. And the invaders from Russia were taking out all their power stations. So the people of Ukraine might have to suffer through a brutal winter without any power. And I remembered from the files that Ted Owens had on occasion affected the weather. One of his demonstrations, in fact, was to create a heat wave in the middle of winter. And so I said to him, I wonder if you could do that. Could you create a heat wave in Ukraine in the middle of the winter so the people there wouldn't have to suffer? And he said he would talk to the space intelligences about it and see what they could do, because that's the way that he worked. And I thought to myself, well, good, we'll set up a test. We'll see what happens in Ukraine over the next 90 days. And I worked with an atmospheric scientist, Annie Caputi, to see if we could actually measure the temperature differences. It turns out that's a very difficult thing to do. I had no idea how difficult it is going into this project, because temperature is correlated from location to location and day to day. So you cannot treat changes in temperature as independent measurements. So I can tell you right now, we did not get anything statistically meaningful because of that. I have nothing statistically meaningful to report to you, but I do think the results were quite interesting. For example, just 4 days after I announced on the New Thinking Aloud channel, which I did on that same day, December 28th, by January 1st, thousands of temperature records were shattered all across Europe. And that's the sort of thing I had come to expect from a Ted Owens demonstration, something really dramatic like that. And the meteorologists, particularly the meteorologists who study rare events, were really puzzled. There was no indication that something like this was about to occur. It just came out of the blue. And many of the meteorologists who were discussing this at the time on their chats and their Twitter pages and so on, they described this event as insane, that they had never seen anything like it. So I thought, wow, we're off to a good start here in this demonstration. And it turns out it was a very warm winter all across Europe. For example, in the Alps, many of the ski resorts had to close because all the snow melted. And here's once again an example of the warm temperatures across all of Europe, including Ukraine, that occurred. And I think this again is January 1st. The warm weather across Europe actually impacted the war in Ukraine, because according to news stories such as this one, it had been Putin's expectation that the Europeans would have to fold because they were dependent on Russian oil and gas to get through the winter. But the warm weather all across Europe meant that Europeans did not need to rely on Russian oil and gas. And furthermore, Russia wasn't getting the revenue it had hoped for by selling oil and gas to Europe. So all of that was favoring Ukraine in the war. And other people thought that it would actually even help end the war. But when we finally ran the statistics on this, you can see that we compared the weather day by day in Ukraine, the average weather from 30 or 40 weather stations in Ukraine, day by day across the 90-day period. And we compared that with the average weather for the same dates for the previous 5 years. So you can see, visually speaking, by this chart, it was a warmer winter, but not statistically so, as far as we could tell. And my colleague, Danny Caputi, when thinking about it, he said, thank goodness, thank God it wasn't statistically significant, because we're in an era of global warming as it is. The previous 5 years were among the warmest ever. And had it been any hotter than it actually was, it would have been dangerous for the whole planet. So I began to realize that statistical significance isn't the only way to look at the kind of large scale phenomenon such as this. Now, in evaluating what had occurred during this study, it dawned on me that there were three different possibilities. One is that because nothing was statistically significant, everything was simply the result of chance events. That Javier Flores in Germany and I myself may have been completely deluded about being in communication with Ted Owens. The second possibility is that these after-death communications were actually real, and that Owens was moving on to another dimension in the afterlife and wanted to say goodbye before heading off to higher spheres. The third possibility is that perhaps Owens wanted to atone for some of his bad behavior while he was alive, because his demonstrations were often unpleasant, and that he was hoping that he could establish, because he spent his whole adult life desperately trying to get scientists to pay attention to his supposed abilities. I was one of the very rare people who gave him the time of day at all. And that he was hoping that he could actually prove the existence of disembodied consciousness by performing similar events from the afterlife, and that he wanted nothing more than to continue to demonstrate phenomenon that he could do, and that only he seemed to have the ability to do, large-scale psychokinetic events like breaking 1,000 temperature records all across Europe in one day. And that what we needed to do was design projects for him that would be both helpful to humanity and hopefully more easy to investigate from a statistical scientific perspective than the weather in Ukraine turned out to be. And I'm going to stop the presentation at this point. And of course, if you're curious, there has been some follow-up, and we've talked about it extensively on the New Thinking Aloud channel, but I don't want to overload you with too much information because I think that what I've already shared with you can be difficult to digest.